listening to Medicalize This podcast. I'm Leng.
And I'm Tremayne Ansani. Medicine loves certainty. Diseases that we can name and test for. When it comes to treatment, we have a sea of medications, procedures, surgeries, and even counseling that healthcare providers use to help their patients heal. We were drawn to data, numbers, and checklists because they give us a clear lens to view things through objective eyes. It comes as no surprise that it's more important to understand pain on a 1 to 10 scale than it is to understand the metaphor that a patient is using when describing pain that feels like a cold wind blowing through my liver. After all, it can mean anything, and that doesn't sound certain. Medicine likes certainty, but it also relies on stories from patients to make sense of what they're going through and in order to provide the best personalized care. Today's guest, Dr. Irène P, works to navigate the delicate balance between the technical jargon of healthcare and the human need for self-expression. She stands at the intersection of poetry and medicine, where things like medical record numbers or vital signs can be turned into something meaningful through writing. Dr. P is a poet, physician, educator, and public health researcher. She is the author of 4 poetry collections, including Milk Tongue, which is the focus of today's conversation. Her writing has appeared in America's Poetry Review, Narrative, Boston Review, Southern Humanities Review, Los Angeles Review, Callaloo, Virginian Quarterly Review, Tri-Quarterly, and numerous anthologies. She is also an assistant professor of pediatrics at the University of Virginia, where she serves as the assistant co-director of the program in health humanities. Before we spoke with Dr. P, we asked her to read a poem from Milk Tongue called Never Have I Ever. Here is Dr. Irène P.
Never have I ever. Mother's Day, I'm at work, where the hospital ward is thick with babies. I enter a room after room to look into their eyes. Long-awaited or unexpected guests, the babies stare at me, solemn and decisive. The next links in the chain of desire older than any of us can imagine. Later that day, I order a hands-free breast pump, giddy with the thought of making myself into food. I love land so much I become it. I want more so badly, I'll make it from my own body. Behind the final door, an operating room, parents beaming under heat lamps, the abundance of twins, my own baby swelling against my scrubs as I congratulate them. Never have I ever wanted so much, eating ice cream at any hour, crying over the chorus of spring peepers dopplering through the passenger window, my whole body a horde of 17-year cicadas wrestling their way up from the dirt. I said I wouldn't want so much the wiser I got, but Earth, forgive me. I got drunk on thick-knotted blackberry rising from the humid flank of this land, breathed a dream of ancient honeysuckle and crabapple, woke in a wetland clutching cattail and throating a swallow's nesting song. This is the day my mother has made. Today I walk into room after room. Today I tell the babies, never have I ever known a way to be that wasn't velvety white on the tongue, sweet, salt, and fat, letters curdled in the mouth, rising from amniotic foam at the moment of the first shout.
We are sitting with Dr. Irène P. Dr. P, welcome.
Hi, thanks so much for having me.
So, Dr. Mathieu, could you first start off by telling us what made you decide to pursue medicine as a pediatrician and also what made you start writing poetry?
Well, I started writing poetry when I was very young as a child. I was pretty much always writing since I could first write. Even before I knew how to physically write, I would tell my mom things and have her write them down for me. So it started pretty early. And I grew up surrounded by medicine. I have doctors in my family, but was never really interested in it for a long time until college when I got involved in some global health work. And that really opened my eyes to the power of medicine, not only in terms of changing people's lives individually, but also in the application of public health and medicine to policy and advocacy, how it could be a really powerful tool for changing people's lives on a systems level. And then I really always was kind of gravitated towards children. I loved interacting with kids. I was oldest out of my cousins and my siblings, and really enjoyed that dynamic. But medically speaking, I really like the fact that children have their whole lives ahead of them. And so when we provide pediatric care, we're really providing care for decades and decades. And that prevention is so powerful because the first few years of a child's life, and then even later when they're teenagers and they're starting to make big life decisions, those things that we do or don't do as pediatricians can really impact the rest of their lives and can impact generations. And I felt that that was a really powerful thing about pediatrics.
Interesting story. So you mentioned that growing up, you have a big love for reading. So I want to ask you, what do you love about reading? And what do you love about language? Also, how does that bleed into your work as a pediatrician and as a poet?
Yeah, I love the transformative power of stories and how they can sort of take you into a completely different person's experience in life, often a fictional person, but sometimes nonfiction too. And the fact that they just really open doors to experiences that you may not otherwise have access to as a reader. I also really just like the craft of telling stories, whether it's in poetry or in prose. I find the language that writers use to be really beautiful and compelling and can often heighten the storytelling experience by really bringing home sensory details or emotional details that would be different if you didn't have such attention to craft. I utilize this in pediatrics because people talk in so many interesting and poetic ways, often without realizing it. And I love paying attention to the metaphors and the similes patients use and the kind of language that they employ to talk about themselves and their stories. And it really kind of similar to reading a good book, it really helps me understand their experience and connect with them. And then in terms of poetry, I think one of the key aspects of poetry that maybe separates it somewhat from prose is that there's such a high level of attention to language. And the function of language as a tool is so important, not just for conveying the content, but also as a tool in and of itself to create beauty or to create a certain type of emotional experience for the reader. So that's a really fun part of writing and reading poetry for me.
Right, I completely agree with your points about language. It is such a powerful tool that can be leveraged to elevate human connections, but also it can serve many functions when it comes to writing in all sorts of forms. Um, and that's the beauty of language, right? So you said that you were born to physicians as parents, but you were not initially interested in medicine until college when you were involved in some global health projects. If you could summarize a moment or a series of moments that really cemented your drive to become a doctor, what would it be?
Yeah, there were two specific moments that I remember. So in college, I was part of a group that went to the Dominican Republic, and it was a longitudinal experience. So once you joined the team, you were expected to go back every year and continue the work rather than just kind of going once and never coming back. So the idea was that was more sustainable than a lot of global health projects at the time were. And I remember two specific episodes that sort of drove this home for me. One was we were doing house calls around the community, and there was a doctor kind of walking around from house to house, and the students, we were following him and kind of seeing what he was doing. And I remember a woman came rushing out into the road as we passed by, and she said, "Doctor, something's wrong with my baby. I need you to just take a look because his head is kind of an interesting shape and size, and no one's really telling me what's going on. Can you just give me your assessment now?" And the doctor stopped and he examined the baby and spoke to the woman and explained what was going on and what she needed to do and who she needed to see. And I remember thinking that it was really powerful that he had this knowledge to be able to provide some sort of help or consolation or advice in that moment. And as students, our role was really more around research. So we would do public health research, and those of us who spoke Spanish would help with interpretation if we could and things like that. But we obviously couldn't actually provide medical care. And so to see somebody who had those credentials to immediately help somebody, and above and beyond what somebody with maybe just a public health degree or some other type of degree could do was really powerful. So I really decided that I valued that skill set of direct care. The second incident was also in the Dominican Republic, and I remember this patient that we had seen a couple of times, this young guy who was in pretty good health and unfortunately got in a very bad motor vehicle accident and had broken both of his legs. And so we, again, were doing house calls. I was with the physician in charge, and he was examining this patient and sort of helping provide some guidance to the mother about what to do and what his prognosis was going to be. And I remember the mom telling the physician that she just felt really, really bad herself, and she was having trouble sleeping. He checked her blood pressure, and it was really high. And then she said, I think I'm just really worried about my son, which was totally understandable and reasonable. And I just remember thinking, wow, as a physician, part of your job is also having the empathy to understand or to try to comprehend what she's going through and make sense of that as an embodied experience that she's going through, and be able to validate that and not simply brush it off or say, well, here's some high blood pressure medication, see you later, but to really empathize and validate her experience and then try to find a more comprehensive way of addressing her issues. So those were the two things that really solidified the power of medicine for me.
I completely agree. Those are very powerful stories about, having to really listen to your patient and hear their stories and really see underlining conditions or underlining factors that are playing a role into everything that happened, as a doctor and using your medical experience, but also the insight of the culture, of the community, of everything. Was there a particular reason why you chose to go to the Dominican Republic? Or I know that you said you did a lot of public health research, or you've done it in Central and South America. Why did those areas appeal to you?
Well, the Dominican Republic was my first experience with global health, and I did it because I was really interested in the dynamics and the setup of the team more so than the location. So at my college, there was a lot of different kind of global health opportunity. There were a lot of different experiences. But what I liked about this particular project was the sustainability aspect and the fact that students were expected to return to the same community every year. Many of us went back multiple times a year, both in summer and winter breaks. Um, and to really cultivate long-term relationships with people in the community, as well as to help with doing research that would address the underlying issues rather than simply going and passing out medications and then leaving, but really trying to partner with folks in the community to address some of the major issues. And so it just happened to be that that was the country where this partnership took place. And that was my first introduction to global health and really my first time in Latin America at all. And sort of in parallel with that, I was learning Spanish as a second language and becoming more and more proficient. And so when I wanted to continue with global health work, I wanted to go somewhere where I had language abilities and could help out without needing an interpreter or translator. And I was really interested in just the history of the region and the culture and the really strong ties with North America as well and the United States. I was an international relations major, and so I was really interested in how U.S. policy has really unfortunately negatively impacted that region and how we can see it, in the U.S. today when we look at migration patterns. And so that relationship, that connection between the U.S. and Latin America was really interesting to me as well.
Wow. So when you returned to the Dominican Republic to work as a Fulbright scholar, what changed about the place or what didn't change? What stayed the same?
Well, it was a totally different experience because unlike being there for the short term with a team and with kind of adults in charge, I was there as a student by myself and I moved there. So it was a huge jump to figure out how to live in the Dominican Republic and not just visit for a week or two or three, but to actually live there for almost a year. And, just the logistics of getting my groceries and all of the things that you do when you live in a place and it's a different language and a different culture from what you're used to. So that was a huge difference. And then the other thing was that, I was doing a research project that I had devised and I was in charge of, but I really didn't have anyone else working with me. I had an advisor in the DR who I could call on if I needed to, who was a Dominican physician. And I gained relationships in the people that I worked with at the clinic where I was collecting data. But, going into it, I didn't have a whole lot of support or infrastructure around me. And so it was a really important lesson in sort of starting something from scratch and figuring out what resources I needed and who I needed to call upon to be able to do the work successfully.
Yeah, it's never easy to build something from scratch. Also, it's nice to hear that you had a good relationship with the people there. Um, would you say that the most profound experience you had happened at work in the context of research, or is it outside of it?
I mean, I had really memorable relationships with people there, and not necessarily in a research context, but just personal relationships. And I learned a ton from those relationships. In some cases, I'm still in touch with people that I met there. And I think those were even more powerful learning experiences than the work itself, although I learned a ton through the research as well.
That's amazing and phenomenal. Um, Now, just to go back a little bit to the poetry side of the conversation, as you know, Dr. Mathieu is a distinguished and published poet, and one of your most recent projects was the Milk Tongue. This is your fourth poetry collection. When did you start working on it, and in what ways was this collection different from the work that you published before? Whether it's the style, whether it's your writing style, how did you feel this work differs from your others?
Yeah, so the poems at Milk Tongue were written between about 2017 and 2022. So it was a 5 year span. And when I think back to kind of what united all of those poems, I think the big overarching theme was adulting. So, in that time period, I went from being a resident in pediatrics to being an attending physician. I went from being unmarried to married. I went from being childless to being pregnant with my first child. So there were a lot of big changes. I moved states. And through those changes, I really felt like I was stepping into truly adult life after the many years of that can feel like prolonged adolescence of being a student and a trainee for so long. And those were kind of the big themes that I was grappling with. And in the context of adulting, I was thinking about the ethical and moral implications in a capitalist society in the setting of climate change, of things that are pretty, quotidian, typical things people do, like having children or buying a home, moving, traveling. And so those were the questions I was grappling with in Milk Tongue. And I think those are sort of represent the maturation of themes that I've been interested in for a long time. But I think what differentiates Milk Tongue is that many of the poems are formally more inventive and a little bit more creative than some of the previous poems. So I experimented with some longer poems in Milk Tongue. There's one poem that's about 8 pages long. I experimented with forms that I had created and even tried putting poems in different orientations on the page. So it feels a little bit more experimental. And that was intentional. I wanted the forms to reflect the questions that I was asking, some of which felt like really hard questions to hold. And so I wanted the forms to really illustrate and speak to those questions authentically.
Yeah, I agree with that. I read your poetry collection, Milk Tongue, and I can say that there are a lot of experiments with characters, language, context, spacing, and even form. I'm curious, how does the way you structure your poems and the style of your writing reflect who you are as a person or the person you are trying to become?
Hmm. I am trying to become a person who is breaking out of the molds and the assumptions and forms that I was given or grew up with. And instead of repeating patterns that I've learned as normative or typical, I want to be creative enough and flexible enough to try to find new ways of doing things, especially since we know that the way that many of us live is not really sustainable and that our systems cannot hold that, and certainly not in a way that's equitable for everyone. And so I'm really interested in pushing myself to think creatively about like what kind of decisions I might make or how I might structure my life in a way that's different from what I've learned or what I see around me to contribute to a society that's more sustainable and more just. And so I think the formal innovation and creativity that you're seeing on the page there is a reflection of that interest, personally as well.
That's right. I was also going to ask, Milk Tongue, that's such a very distinctive name. What made you decide to name your poetry collection Milk Tongue?
So, milk tongue is actually a pediatric term. And as you may know, it refers to when a baby drinks a lot of formula or milk, they often will get a white film on their tongue. And that is, it's really important to distinguish that from thrush, which is an overgrowth of naturally occurring yeast that babies can also get, but that needs to be treated with an antifungal, whereas milk tongue is just harmless milk that will disappear after a few hours. And I was really interested in that kind of line between the overgrowth of something that could potentially be harmful and just the normal process of consumption, and how the line between what is normal consumption and what is pathological overgrowth can be really blurry in our own lives too. So that was sort of the conceptual thought behind the title, but it also comes from one of the poems in the book where I reference milk tongue directly. So it's kind of a direct reference to that poem as well.
Well said. So going back to the poem that you read, it opened with a scene of a pediatrician walking into a room full of babies, newborn babies, and I was like, this is such a profound scene because it opens with a unique, intimate experience that only doctors have. So I want to ask you, how does your practice as a clinician make its way into your poetry, and how often does it make its way into your poetry, and vice versa?
Hmm. I think it finds its way into my writing um, indirectly and sort of minimally, in the sense that I don't really like to write too much about patients specifically, mostly for privacy concerns because I'm not asking people for consent to write about them. And so I feel a little strange about writing other people's stories. And when other patients and other people do enter my poems, it's usually in the context of me understanding my experience in that frame rather than being about them, because it's not really my story to tell. But where I do think that it enters more indirectly is that I'm really interested in social determinants of health and the upstream factors that lead patients into my care. And those are bigger questions about history and inequality, the environment, society, that I think I write about more broadly. And I often write about those themes in the context of my own life and my own family as a way to sort of present a case study. But I think you could argue that, those themes are related to patient care, and that, again, those are the factors that influence other people's lives too. And so I'm just sort of using myself as an example of trying to understand how those things really do play out in people's lives.
Yeah, so in art, not just poetry, the arts in general, artists and writers often make themselves vulnerable to become the voice for something bigger than themselves in order to instigate conversations. Many artists and writers that I spoke to consider that as a duty to do so. I want to ask you, how often do you have to walk the line between being too personal in your poems and maintaining that professional tone your patients theoretically expect of you as a doctor, as their doctor?
Hmm. I'm really an open book, Lee, and I think that a lot of writers probably are. So I actually have no discomfort with personal disclosure, and I recognize that, my patients could pick up my books and learn things about me that I wouldn't necessarily tell them in the exam room. But I also think that, doctors are human beings and we all have lives outside of our professions. And I like to think that part of what makes a relationship between any two people, whether it's doctor and patient or two friends, authentic, is recognizing the other person's full humanity and vulnerability. And so while it may not be appropriate in the exam room for me to reveal certain personal details of my life, if a patient happens upon it on the internet or in one of my books, I don't have a problem with that. It's just part of who I am. And I certainly wouldn't put anything out there that I wouldn't want, everyone to see or know about. I think it becomes a bigger challenge when I have to consider my loved ones who may make it into my poems. And so when I am writing very personal poetry that involves other people that I'm close to, I do try to get permission and run things by them so that they're not blindsided by finding themselves in print.
I was just also gonna quickly ask, just with all your responsibilities as a physician and just all the writing that you do and writing or publishing everything, do you find it hard to balance your responsibilities as a physician with your writing, or find it hard to find the best times to write? Or what's your balance for being a physician but also investing a lot of time into writing and being personable and publishing? And yeah.
Yeah, Tremaine, that's a moving target. I feel like I think about it less as a balance and more as different threads that are part of my life that kind of weave in and out. And so, to be frank, I don't think I've written a new poem in 3 months, maybe more. And there are seasons like that. And then there are times when I write a lot and I just kind of go with the flow. In addition to being a clinician, I'm a researcher, I run a lab, I'm a teacher, and I lead a couple of electives for fourth year medical students, as well as teaching in the clinic. I'm a mother, I am a partner. I wear a lot of hats, as many of us do. And what I always tell students and young people is that I never do all of those things on one day. I'm never teaching and seeing patients and doing research and writing poetry and, being a person in my personal life all at once. It's always a couple of things here and a couple of things there. And there are seasons when one part of that becomes a little bit dormant. And so something else can take precedence. And I just sort of allow that ebb and flow. But I do try to carve out time for myself to stay connected to literature. And mostly that involves carving out time for me to read, because I find that when I have writer's block or when I'm struggling to find the words, what I need to be doing is reading more. So I do try to read pretty regularly.
Yeah, I cannot stress it enough. Reading is so important for me and obviously for everyone else. Uh, you don't have to invest a lot of time into reading if you don't have time. Just find something short to read throughout the day and it should be enough. It's also reading, it's a healthy food for the brain. There's strong evidence for that. So it's not indisputable fact that reading is good for you. Also, on the notes of reading, have you been able to do any book tour or any events since the release of Milk Tongue?
Yeah, I've done what I call a modified book tour. This is my first book publication since the birth of my child. And it is very different thinking about a book tour when you have a toddler as opposed to pre-child life. And so my book tour has looked like every couple of months I may do a reading, whether virtually or in person, and then I don't do anything for a couple months, and then I pop back up and do a reading. So I haven't done like a compressed, multi-city travel extravaganza over a 3-week period. That's like the classic book tour. But I've sort of thought about the first year after it's released as a way to have an extended sort of slow motion book tour. And that's pacing has felt really good for me at this stage in my life.
Can we do another poem? A second poem?
Absolutely. Flashpoint. The people who were killed, the people who died this week, drifted from the branches and were swept into piles into which the children threw themselves. When the air gets colder, inevitably my thoughts turn to reproduction. It is easier to slice a cell open than to divide it. Sometimes I imagine long dead people reassembling, rehydrating, suddenly alive again. For instance, my grandfather. As a child, I feared spontaneous combustion. As an adult, I constantly feel flammable. My body is easy to crumple and light as a leaf. The page offers fuel, my gathering anxiety and aphrodisiac. Could I teach my future children how to be anything other than at war? There is so much lying in wait on our stoops, behind the flower pots, according to our neurons. I still jump back when the spider who lives on my front porch scuttles away from my fingers reaching for the door handle. She and I spend all day trying not to think about our deaths. Behind my sternum, a rope tightens.
Wow, it was amazing. Well read. So the reason why I picked this poem specifically was because I recognized the contrast between this poem and the previous poem you read for us. Um, the previous poem was mostly about life and how one watch life happens, whereas this poem is filled with some heavy images of death and how you grapple with death And almost certainly, this duality of life and death is what medicine is about, right? Doctors save lots of lives, but on some sad occasions, they also witness death. And science as a language is not enough to process this, but you also need humanities, reflective writing to make sense of things. So I want to ask you, what do you think are the overlaps between poetry and medicine, and how both can help healthcare providers understand this human experience that is death?
Hmm. I think that, you know, one overlap, and this isn't exactly getting at what you're asking, but one overlap that I think about a lot is that they're both forms of using language in very specific ways to get at that complexity of the human experience and that duality and vulnerability. And so in medicine, I think about that language as science. Essentially, you go through medical training, you learn science, and science is beautiful and wonderful in and of itself. And obviously, some people just love science the way some people love language and will experiment with it as their career. But in medicine, I think that science is also a language. It's a means to an end for understanding and translating a certain type of human experience. And similarly, language is a way to translate things that are really hard to articulate in other ways using poetry. And so I think about both as trying to translate these really complex, difficult human experiences, such as the closeness of life and death and the anxiety that it can provoke, that there is this duality, and we have to kind of accept that with life comes always death at some point, right? And so there's a lot of, I think, emotional vulnerability in Milk Tongue in my attempt to authentically showcase that and verbalize that. And I think in medicine, you have to become comfortable with seeing that vulnerability and that duality in your patients as well, and understanding that you're going to be there on some of the best days of people's lives and some of the worst days. And how do you be present for them in all circumstances and under all conditions?
I completely agree. As you stated before, just reading and understanding more about humanities can help you understand more about people's stories and relate to people better. But I know just with the cultural medicine, do you think that there's anything that being involved in medicine can help with understanding more of the humanities or understanding readings better or anything?
Um, I think that medicine can definitely teach us, again, kind of about the complexity of the human condition, and that can be really helpful both in writing if we're writers or artists and in kind of creating art, but also in understanding the books that we read, understanding art and the humanities as a reader or as a consumer of art. And so I definitely find that medicine enhances my practice of the humanities in many ways, and vice versa.
Oh, I just also had another quick question. Just I feel like when you read poems and everything, you imagine it and you have this whole story, but then also when you hear the speaker, or when I hear like the speaker read their poem, it just with their tone and the diction and their pragmatic, it gives me a whole new meaning and understanding of poetry. How do you, or I was just gonna ask, does it take a while? Did it take a while for you to develop your tone in reading, or just how do you read your poetry, or how do you imagine? I just feel like the way that you your diction and your pragmatic the way that you speak, it adds so much to it. So I was just gonna ask if there like a way that you envision when you read, or a way that you envision your story when you write it is the same as when you're speaking it.
Hmm. I think that my sort of voice when I read out loud has developed kind of naturally over the years. And it's interesting because, people that are close to me will say that it's like my poet voice. And it's funny because I'm not trying to have it be like an affect, but I think that it's just sort of a natural thing that happens. But when I am reading, I'm thinking consciously about making sure I'm pronouncing things clearly, that I'm pacing in a way where people can really internalize and grasp what I'm saying, especially because poetry is often written in a way that's different from prose. So it may be harder for people to catch in the moment and understand than if you're just speaking normally, conversationally. So I'm conscious of that and trying to make sure that people can really grasp what I'm saying. But I also try to read in a way that, while I recognize I have this kind of poetic lilt to my voice, I try to read in a way that is somewhat conversational. So I want to vary my tone. I try to vary the way that I pronounce things in my diction so that it's also not just lulling people to sleep in a monotone, and that people feel like they're being spoken to and that they're being told a story in a sense.
Yeah, and I want to point out that your pronunciation was very clear when you were reading the two poems. Also, it's fascinating listening to you reading the poems out loud. And it's a completely different experience for me compared with when I was reading the poem inside my head. And I have to admit that when I'm reading a poem, I tend to just focus on what the poem is about and ignore or forget how it would sound when it is being read out loud. And you really did a wonderful job of adding to the poem and added layers of emotion and passions through your cadence, your emphasis, and the tone and other things.
Yeah, and I love hearing other writers read their own work. And when I teach poetry in my classes, if I can find the recording of the writer reading their own work, I will always play that over having me or somebody else read it aloud, because I agree there's just something so amazing that you gain from hearing the poet in their voice read the poem, how they hear it, how they imagine it.
Yeah, so what is your favorite poetry collection? Not favorite, but what poetry collection are you reading these days? And which poets or writers have the most influence on your writing?
There's so many people. And I always feel like I'm going to leave people out. But poets that I've been thinking about a lot recently and reading would be Sophia Sinclair. I teach her work a lot. I often teach or reference Aracelis Girmay and Tyree Day. Um, I've been reading this collection called 50 Poets on 50 Poems, which is out by Grey Wolf Press, and it has some really amazing poets. And then each poem is paired with an essay by another poet, kind of explaining or providing a reaction to the poem. So that's been really fun to read too, and such a diversity of voices in that book. Um, yeah, just a lot of people.
Yeah, we love it. Everything. Just love it. So I want to switch gear and start diving into the concept of narrative medicine. So on the other podcast, you talked about your ongoing effort to integrate narrative medicine into your teaching at medical school. How would you define narrative medicine? What is it basically?
Yeah. So I really like Rita Sharon's definition. She's one of the foremost scholars of narrative medicine, and she says that it's really the use of narrative practices, which is close reading and reflective writing, to help us improve our practice of medicine. And so if you break that down, the close reading is really just immersing ourselves in literature and really understanding how to closely read it and comprehend literature, literary works. And then the reflective writing is writing vulnerably and authentically and deeply to better understand ourselves and our experiences. And so I would say narrative medicine is those two things working in tandem to improve ourselves as medical practitioners.
That's incredible. I read some of your nonfiction writings and the writings that you published on many platforms. So you wrote extensively about these two concepts. The first concept is called critical consciousness, and the second concept is called structural competency. I'm wondering if you can tell us and the audience here what are these two concepts about.
Yeah, so critical consciousness comes from originally the Brazilian educator Paulo Freire, and he was a political scientist and educator. And he basically came up with this idea in the 1970s that instead of education being what he called the banking model, where you think about teachers as like banks with all of the knowledge or all of the money, and then they give that knowledge to students, and you just fill up the students with knowledge, so then they regurgitate it on a test. That learning should be actually a bidirectional interaction that's around understanding people's real lived experiences and social positions. And through that type of knowledge that's generated among students and between students and teachers, you can actually empower people to change their social position and to make a difference in society. So, critical consciousness for me really resonates when I think about narrative medicine, because the idea of reading and writing for physicians shouldn't just be only for self care or only to just collect more stories in the bank of stories, but to actually apply that knowledge to making changes in the way we take care of patients, and hopefully changes in broader society, and becoming more critically aware of systems and structures that influence our patients' lives that we may not be able to see as individuals. Structural competency was coined by Jonathan Metzl, one of my mentors from med school, and Helena Hansen, and they define structural competency kind of as an iteration of, if you think about ideas of cultural competency and cultural humility, and they say that it's not enough to understand differences among cultures, but that we have to understand the differences in structures that really inform and shape people's lives. So, for instance, instead of assuming that one patient may not be taking their medication because they're from a different culture, we would interrogate that further and say maybe they're not taking their medication because they don't have access to food and they actually need to take it with food, or maybe they're having to choose between groceries and medication, and when they have to make that choice, they're going to choose food. Or maybe they don't have a place to live and being houseless is a bigger stressor than their medical condition. So understanding the structures that really circumscribe our patients' lives is really important. And I think that narrative medicine can help us with that, because they help us kind of illustrate those structures in a more distanced way. You can read about the plight of somebody in a book in a way that's a little bit less emotionally charged and a little bit more removed, but you can easily see how these factors and structures influence people, and then you can apply that when you're actually faced with real patients and real scenarios.
Yeah, I completely agree with your point. I think what we learn from books at school is not necessarily what the reality is about. We know that reality it's more nuanced and more complex than just what we are exposed to at school. So the earlier we understand that, the more prepared we are to handle situations in real life when they arise. I want to ask you, what do you think is the best way to facilitate the incorporation of narrative medicine in the world of healthcare and beyond?
Well, I think that it starts really with medical education and how we teach and train young scientists and physicians to be. And I think that we need to ensure that our education includes not only the most cutting edge scientific advancements and medical advancements, but also the patient's narratives, the stories, and the experiences that also are part of those advancements, or inform those advancements. Because unless we understand what people are actually going through, it's really hard to apply how a particular scientific advancement or discovery might actually impact somebody's real life, not just their one organ system or the lab number that you're following, but their life as a human being. And so I think that curiosity starts early, and some people have it from an early age. Some people just love reading or love learning about other people and kind of have that natural ability to connect and be curious about other people. But for those who don't, and even for those who do, but are going to be subjected to a very grueling medical education, I think we need to keep that part of folks alive and to cultivate it by infusing poetry and art and literature and patient stories and sharing our own stories and reflective writing throughout medical education. And I know that's really hard to do because there's already a lot people need to learn in 4 years. So I'm not suggesting that medical schools add a whole other course or a whole other year's worth of coursework, but more that those of us who teach classes and already are involved in those spaces find ways to kind of slip in little bits of arts and humanities where we can, to illustrate what we're teaching from a different perspective.
I was going to say, I completely agree. Along with medicine, there's a very humanistic side of medicine in which science just can't give the direct yes or no answer. It's important to understand people, understand culture, understand society in order to really decide and create the best healthcare for people.
Yeah, and not just to create the best healthcare for people, but also to create the best working environment for healthcare providers to be at their best self to take care of their patients. Dr. Matthew, I want to ask you, how do you think poetry play a role in promoting narrative medicine and teaching health equity?
Yeah, I think that poetry is uniquely positioned to do this because poems are often pretty short and poems can be really powerful. You could just pull out one line from a lot of poems and really have an emotional impact in a way that's hard to do with a whole novel or a short story. And I think, physicians are so busy, medical students and trainees are really busy. We don't necessarily have time to sit and read a 300-page novel and then discuss it, but it doesn't take that long to read a half a page poem and discuss it, or to make time with morning coffee to just share, one page of poetry. And so I think that poems can be a nice entree into narrative medicine and to the role of literature in medicine. I think the obstacle that I see is that a lot of people have negative feelings around poetry because of what they may have experienced in high school, and people reading and being taught only poems by people writing in like 20 in 15th century English and things like that. So I think that part of my job as a practitioner of narrative medicine is to introduce people to the wide variety and diversity of contemporary poets as well as the styles of poetry that exist, because people may be surprised if they haven't read any poetry since 11th grade English class of what's out there.
Yeah, I can vividly recall my 10th grade English class having to read Shakespeare poems, and one of the poem I think starts with the line, "How shall I compare thee to a summer day?" And for me personally, I just found the language to be irrelevant in today's world, and this aspect of irrelevance, I think is one of the factors that discourage a lot of readers from trying poetry. And these days, a lot of poems are written in more relevant language, which makes it more accessible and digestible for readers. And also, yeah, I really appreciate that. Yeah, Jermaine, what do you have to say?
I was just gonna say there. I know you talked about how right now you kind of don't have a scheduled thing, and you kind of go through everything based off of kind of, or you're doing a modified tour. But is there anything else special that you're working on, or anything that you're looking to do in the future in regards to writing, or anything else?
Yeah, well, I'm writing new poems, not super regularly, but trying when I can. So hopefully that will turn into another collection at some point. I also have an agent for my prose, and we are almost to the point of being ready to start finding a home for my middle grade debut novel. So stay tuned for that. That's in the works. I'm really excited about that and to kind of delve into the fiction world. And I'm also considering nonfiction and essays, things like that. So I hope that in the next 2 years, you'll see not only more poetry from me, but also some prose.
Well, just to wrap things up, I just want to ask, what advice would you give to healthcare professionals who want to expose themselves to poetry but don't know where to start? And also, what advice would you give to writers who want to deepen their knowledge of science but don't know how to start?
Yes, to the first part of your question, I wrote a blog post that I don't know if you can put in the show notes maybe, where I list 10 poetry books that have been really instrumental to me and that I think make great entryway books for people who maybe are out of practice of reading poetry, and especially for folks who have an interest or a foot in the medical world. All of these books, I think, have some relevance either through structural competency, critical consciousness, or directly talking about medical issues. So we could maybe share that with people, but I think there are some really great places to start if you haven't read poetry in a while. And I think if you are a writer and you want to learn more about science, that's a tougher one for me to answer because I kind of don't know what it's like to not be involved in science and medicine and to think about that perspective. Um, but I think there are a lot of amazing physician writers who are writing in not so ways that are not so full of jargon and scientific terms. And so a lot of the folks who are writing in that vein of narrative medicine, medical humanities, such as Abraham Verghese, Rachel Pearson, just a lot of people like that who are writing about their experiences and about science in ways that are really accessible to anyone.
Can we end with a poem?
Sure. Third attempt at going home. If not rejection of the commodification of my identity, if not neither here nor there, if not subject to crosswinds and climate change, if not a loose net of stories, if not always something there to remind me, if not a sonata, if not a trinity, if not holy, if not a three-legged dog, if not the taste of bread, if not a manifestation of ego, if not a shadowy projection, if not a wild eel, if not electrifying and difficult to hold, if not an intergenerational rope of muscle, if not the negative of what surrounds it, if not black and white, if not covered in blood, if not a sight of conscience, if not a sight of relief, if not a citation in the bibliography of self, if not requiring me, if not required for my sins of self, if not about ownership, if not about the reappearance of names, if not about languaging existence onto land, if not a survival mechanism, if not that which keeps a body in motion, if not an antidote to stagnation, death, if not a bright dream burning as we run toward it, if not flammable as my hair, if not made of matchsticks and sugar cubes, if not an unreadable map to an empty room, if not a place to set it down, everything down, to lay it out, to finally say what we are, once and for all, then I don't know what.
Thanks for listening. This episode of Medicalize This was produced by me, Lê Nguyen, and Tremayne Ansani. Special thanks to Kayla Wong, our editor-in-chief, for giving this episode the best shape possible. Our original theme music and additional music come from Blue Dot Sessions. If you enjoy the show, please help others find us by telling your friends about us, posting our episodes on social media, or leaving us a review and rating on your favorite podcast app. I'm your host, Lê. See you next time.